Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we bring you episode number 53, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, currently on Netflix. But before we get started, just a quick housekeeping note. Please go sign up on the website for our newsletter. That went out again today with the new episode. Again, as you might know if you've listened to the last few episodes, we record these about a week ahead of time. So today's episode went out on last week's episode, number 52, Whiplash. But please sign up on the website that is linked in the show notes for our newsletter. There's some additional content, and I'll continue to upgrade that as we continue to go along. Also, because this is a new kick that we're on, I am announcing next week's movie in advance just to make sure that you have time to go watch it. So if you're a regular listener and you've been able to do this, next week's movie is Wall-E on Disney+. So if you have Disney+, go watch it on there. It is a Pixar movie, as I understand it. I've never actually seen it. I know a lot of people love it, but we also are going to be having on a special guest that I will announce at the end of the episode. All right. So, Dad, this was a movie I let you pick, and I do regret giving you the opportunity to do so, but why did you pick this?
Because it's one of my favorites. It's a movie that I can quote lines from all day long.
And, is that something that somebody should pick on you for?
Well, I don't...
You mean a true double standard?
Okay. So, only those that wear Batman underwear can get away with stuff.
I've never worn Batman underwear.
Mm-hmm.
There have been other characters and cartoons on my buttock, but never Batman.
Okay. Anyway.
Nor Spider-Man, in case anybody was interested in that. I don't know how much longer anyone wants to talk about my buttock.
Okay.
I don't know what the plural of that is other than maybe buttocks.
Buttocks.
Butt-eye?
No.
Buttocks?
No.
Okay. Anyway.
Let's move on.
All right. So I can remember the first time that I watched this film, but since this was your pick, do you remember the first time you saw this?
Yes, I do. I was in high school. There was a group of people that were on the newspaper staff with me who were raving about this film and how funny it was. And I started to watch it, and I was completely going, what in the world is this? And then somebody told me, well, don't just start with the Holy Grail. The TV show is on PBS at the time, I believe, in Wisconsin Public TV, I think, had it. Watch that a few episodes so you get used to the timing, the pace, and what the humor is, then go back, and which I did, and thought it was hilarious at that point.
Okay. Do you remember the first time you tried to show it to me?
No, I don't.
So I'll take you back to the day of Super Bowl 35. Do you know who played in that game?
Not offhand.
So it was another Super Bowl in Tampa Bay, since we just recently had one, and it was the Ravens and the Giants. And that score was rather lopsided, and that is, in my opinion, the greatest defense I've ever seen. So the 2000 Ravens, led by Ray Lewis and Rod Woodson at the time, beat the Giants 35-7. After the Giants had whipped up, thankfully, on the Minnesota Vikings in the NFC Championship game, 41-0. So, but anyway, you tried to introduce this movie to me. No more than we got to the coconut scene, and somebody called you and said, "Oh, the Super Bowl is on. Oh, I didn't think it started at 5:00." And so we turned on the game, and the next play was Brandon Staley's first touchdown that basically ended the game for the Giants because they were never in it after that.
Okay.
So the first time you tried to show this to me was the same day that Trent Dilfer won a Super Bowl.
Okay.
Special meaning. Anyway, and I maintain that I feel about the same about this movie as I did back then. What the fuck is this shit?
Okay.
This is one of the most nonsensical, overtly absurd things. Of all the comedies that you've tried to show me, or that, like, you've asked me to try and share in you, this is the one where I draw the line. Airplane, sure. Blazing Saddles, absolutely. Caddyshack, uproarious. Monty Python, chirp, 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 chirp. So anyway, your plot summary.
Coconut-wielding Brits fight absurdity and silliness in the quest for the Holy Grail. I thought it was simple and straightforward because you really can't describe a character per se because all of the Pythons play multiple
7 parts.
Yes, they play multiple parts, and you have a hard time remembering when you're not watching the film who's doing which part. But whether it's certain ones, John Cleese was the Black Knight. John Cleese was the old warlock or whatever he was with the ram's horns.
You mean Tim?
Yes, Tim. They call me Tim. Anyway, Graham Chapman was always Arthur, and
he also
Terry
was
Gilliam was Patsy, his sidekick.
Coconut-wielding sidekick, yes.
Yes, that was clicking the coconut shells, because they made this film for like $500,000. And so they were like, how in the world are we going to ever afford horses for this? So they came up with this idea of just what they do on radio, which is click coconut shells together to sound like horse hooves. So they thought it was absurd, so that's what they did. They just had somebody click coconut shells together, and instead of actually having horses. So,
all right, for the recognition on this film, this has grown in stature ever since its release. At the time, it was not a critical success, and frankly, most critics deadpanned it. However, in the years since, Monty Python and the Holy Grail has grossed more than any other British film exhibited in the U.S. from 1975. In the U.S., it was selected as the second best comedy of all time in an ABC special, Best in Film, The Greatest Movies of Our Time. In the UK, readers of Total Film magazine in 2000 ranked it as the 5th greatest comedy film of all time, and a similar poll of Channel 4 viewers in 2006 placed it 6th. I would like to add that the movie I actually think is funnier, Life of Brian, or as I mistakenly called it when I was about 13, Life of Brain, it was ranked higher on all of those lists.
Okay. It is a funny film. It does have certain sensitivity issues as far as religion for those of us who are religious.
I think that's actually more acceptable, but we'll get to that at a different time. Anyway, so what is this movie about? And I'm just going to give you my version of it. You tell me.
It's exactly it. It's the story of King Arthur, told in the most absurd, silly manner they possibly could, where you have 6 pythons who are at their creative best at that moment in time. They were all young men who were at the height of their creativity, and they put together something that was together, more or less, a brilliant montage of the type of humor they did on their TV show. I don't know. It's either you like it or you don't. If you don't like it, fine, whatever.
Well, comedy is very subjective. Comedy is very subjective, so I really can't disagree on that. It just is. It's either it tickles your funny bone or it doesn't.
Okay, first scene. They're sitting there clicking the coconut shells.
That's not the first scene.
More or less it is. Yes, it is. Unless you're counting the credits, which
I am, because the subtitles is his own joke.
Well, of course. So, but all right. So So, of course, now they have to figure out how do you explain these guys clicking coconut shells. So they come up with this, that a swallow is supposedly carrying a coconut. And how does a 5-ounce swallow carry a 1-pound coconut? Well, they could, do it in tandem, and and they make the whole absurdity about swallows carrying coconuts. And then that theme is raised several points throughout the film. So, and it's kind of a running joke.
So who was your best performer?
I've always had a strong affinity towards John Cleese. I think he did a phenomenal job in each part he played. But it's very close with Michael Palin, who I think also did a phenomenal job.
I went with John Cleese. I think he simply had the most to do. He played the most characters that come to mind, as we already mentioned. He was Tim, he was the Black Knight, he was Sir Lancelot, and he was the French Taunter.
Yes.
And most of the iconic moments of the particular movie do involve him. I'm going to save part of it because he's also my most charismatic, so I won't completely undercut myself there. But I don't know. I think he did the most, and I think he, by far, of any of these guys, is the funniest.
I would tend to agree. I think part of my feelings towards Cleese and what I think about Cleese is based on the fact that he was trained as a barrister, graduated as a lawyer, but went into comedy writing instead. So there's a certain aspect of that that's, I don't know, crossover.
I'll take it back to the notion of comedy going back to Laurel and Hardy type of archetypes, the tall man and the fat man. And I think Cleese is an extremely talented tall man or straight man because not only is he good enough to set up all of the jokes, but he gets his own laughs. Yes. But I'll talk more about that more here in a second in most charismatic. So who was your best secondary?
Well, I gave it to Graham Chapman just because he was on screen so much as Arthur that he had a lot to do. It wasn't always the most funny, but I gave it to him for that reason. I thought about giving it to Terry Jones as the director because he had to put this montage of silliness together and make it seem like it all meshed. But
well, he was only one of two directors.
Well, Terry Gilliam directed the artistic aspect of it. The actual film director was Jones.
Okay. I went with Chapman too, though, because I think there is a lot to do with the Arthur character while making it seem serious, yet not a lot of his parts set up the absurdity of the other characters surrounding him, because he really doesn't have any jokes of his own. He's able to play into everybody else by being the most serious character, and that's kind of a hard role to play and play well. So if you enjoy this movie, you usually are underappreciative of the amount that he's having to carry as far as the comedic backbone. All right, so let's move to most charismatic. I already said I have John Cleese, so I'll just finish up my point on him. I simply like John Cleese the most because, as I was kind of hinting at a little bit before, I think he's the funniest of any of these characters. I think it also helps that he was in several Bond films, so, I mean, he's got that as far as my vote, too. But I also think, and it's this one small quality, he doesn't have to do a silly, stupid face or this weird expression that in order to get the joke out or get people to laugh. It's like how people used to describe George Lopez. You remember the George Lopez School of Comedy?
Yes.
Yeah, where you just finish off every joke and then you bug your eyes out. Well, except that it seems like George Lopez picked that up from Michael Palin and Eric Idle. Because every time they finish a joke, they just make some weird face.
Okay. I'll watch for that next time. I'm not saying that I agree, but
That's just the way I took it. You can take it simply as my own opinion. I like Michael Palin, but it just seemed like every time they had to finish off a joke, they had to make some weird expression to just highlight that, oh yeah, you're supposed to laugh right now.
Okay.
I actually think Idol has gotten much better in his old age when he's more subtle and underhanded. Like if he's doing interviews, I actually think he's much more charismatic and funny.
Okay.
So who's your most charismatic?
I had Cleese for that very reason. He's had the biggest careers in movies and in acting of any of them. You know, and he just has a certain presence. Whether it's A Fish Called Wanda, and he's done other parts as well. He just kind of has always had that knack. He's done a ton of commercials, humorous commercials and such through the years that as well. So he's just had a very large presence on stage and in film and TV.
All right. I'll let you nominate the first of best scenes.
We are the knights who say nee. That's one of the scenes that I find is the most funny because it's completely absurd. They're seeking a shrubbery, which is just another idiotic thing. And you know, I found it funny then, and I still find that scene funny. In fact, a lot of times I've used the term or have quoted the line for various things that I'm a knight who says nee.
Yes, I think there will be many different quotes in here. This is more quotable than it is a scene movie.
Agreed.
Because I think a lot of the lines are pulled out in certain moments of context as the jokes, as opposed to the setup or the sketch itself. So I think that's going to be the more interesting part of this particular episode. But my first one, and it's probably one of the most iconic from this movie, I'm going to go with The Black Knight.
Okay.
And it simply put, the amount of times that, and this is also why it's my most indelible moment, it's the first thing anybody ever talks about when they describe this movie. Which I find fascinating because to me, and I've always thought it was kind of ridiculous, it is by far to me one of the least funny sections of this movie. I think I've grown to appreciate it a little bit in the absurdity as I go along, but I've never had more than a small chuckle at this particular scene. And yet anytime this movie comes up, that's the thing that they pull out. And so, I mean, this thing is on flippin' T-shirts that I see around, just randomly at Comic-Con. So
just a flesh wound.
What are you talking about? Your arm's off. I've had worse. That's what she said. Yes. Anyway. All right, what's your next one?
The Tale of Sir Lancelot.
All right, so that was one of my nominees.
Michael Palin up talking to Terry Moore, who's supposedly his son. He's about to get married, and he says, you're about to marry a woman who's got really big tracts of land, with his hands very strategically placed.
Yes, that one has been a running gag over our household for many a year.
Yes, because the first time I used it was with your mother, who had no idea what I was talking about.
Yeah, and it's so good that she's not going to listen to this episode right now.
Well, I think I said it with Uncle Andy there, and of course he busts a gut. So
yeah, because he's a Python fan.
Yes.
You got to play to your audience.
Oh yeah. So
I nominated it, but I think it was just for a different reason entirely. That particular line is one you pull out, but I think the just ridiculousness of that weird marching, they play that same clip 5 times in a row with the music of Lancelot trying to run up to the castle, and then all of a sudden he just starts stabbing everybody.
Yes.
And then he's like, oh, well, I thought there was a damsel in distress. And yeah, some of the lines of that will be coming up here as we go along. So again, I don't want to completely ruin my takes by getting too involved in some of the scenes. Again, this is a lines movie as opposed to scenes. So maybe not the depth or the quality that we normally get into in particular scenes. Did you have another one?
Exploiting the masses, or the scene with Arthur walking through the field and Michael Palin starts saying, well, who elected you king? And
oh, there's some nice filth over here.
Yes, going on and on about how they're a commune that's independently run, and you're not our king, and it's a purely political thing that's making fun of the whole idea of monarchy.
Yes, as well, there will be lines pulled from that going forward as well. One I did not actually nominate a line for because I think this might be one of the few where it's the total scene, the Bridge of Death. It's been probably the scene that I talk about most often, and it is also my nominee for favorite scene. It was the one that has always stuck out in my mind. What is your favorite color? The part that I've now in watching this in retrospect, because it's probably been, at least 15 years since I've seen this movie, was, what is the capital of Assyria? Do you have any more nominees?
The scene with Tim leading into the cave, the rabbit with the gnarly teeth. So that whole scene in and of itself is, I always found hilarious.
I'm out of nominees, so it's up to you at this point.
The tale of Sir Robin was good, as was the tale of Sir Galahad, where he's, well, you really don't have to save me. I'm fine. You have to be out of here. So, and then the other scene leading up to Camelot, where Terry Jones is the wise knight who gets brought a witch to determine whether or not she really is a witch. So I can already tell you one of my favorite lines is, she turned me into a newt. It got better.
Yes, that was also one I picked out. All right, so what is your favorite scene then?
Boy, it's so difficult to pick on this because there's so many that I enjoyed. It's got to be the whole scene, the rabbit, the cave, and the bridge. That whole sequence towards the end that is just so memorable and funny.
Okay. And your most indelible moment?
The Black Knight.
Yeah, that's what I went with too, as I already mentioned. I think that just has a legacy that is set apart from the movie itself. All right, well, this is traditionally where we take a quick break for one of our sponsors. We will be right back. All right, welcome back. Let's jump into best lines, which may be the best part of this episode. So, what is your first nominee?
Your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries.
I nominated the whole line. I followed in your general direction. Your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries. Is there anyone else up there that we can talk to? No. Now go away, or I shall taunt you a second time. All right, my first nominee had to be my first nominee because I've known this particular line since I was about 3 years old, maybe even sooner than that. And this has a certain sentimental value to me because as someone used it when we played Fisher-Price Castle and we'd take breaks in the middle of our battles. Bring out your dad. I wonder who that man might have been.
I don't know. Yes.
Your next nominee.
She turned me into a newt. A newt? I got better. think I've used that a few times, too.
I'm not an old woman. Well, then what am I to call you? Well, you could call me Dennis. Honestly, that might have been the biggest laugh I got all night because I had no memory of that line.
What? A swallow carrying a coconut? It could get it by the husk. It's not a question of where he grips it. It's a simple question of weight ratios. A 5-ounce bird cannot carry a 1-pound coconut. Well, it doesn't matter. Will you go and tell your master that Arthur from the court of Camelot is here? Listen, in order to maintain airspeed velocity, a swallow needs to beat its wings 43 times every second, right? Please. Am I right?
I am your king. Well, I didn't vote for you. You don't vote for kings. Well, how'd you become king then? The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I am your king. Listen, strange women, lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. Help! I'm being oppressed! Come and see the violence inherent in the system!
It's only a flesh wound.
'Tis but a scratch. A scratch? Your arm's off. No, it isn't. Well, what's that then? I've had worse. In order to pass through these woods, you must find a shrubbery.
Yes. I thought your son was a girl. That's understandable.
And after the spanking, the oral sex. Well, I suppose I could stay a bit longer.
Go boil your bottom, you sons of silly persons.
You only killed the bride's father, you know. Well, I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to? You put your sword right through his head. Oh, dear. Is he all right?
Yes.
All right, you got any more?
No, I mean, I could probably think of a few, where the rabbit with the gnarly teeth but let's just move on because, I mean, the entire film at some point is almost all quotable.
All right, so then let's move to our Stanley rubric. All right, first up is Legacy. What did you have down?
9. For the simple fact that this film is probably even more popular now than it was then, and continues to be something that a lot of people quote, and it's passed through generations. There are Python fans of all ages. Obviously, you're not one of them, but there are others of your ilk who are.
All right, so I'm going to give this 9.5.
Really?
Yes, really. I think this is something that is, there are certain comedians that are the comedians. I think in a certain way the Pythons in stature are the comedians, or the sketch group of comedians. Like, even to a certain extent, I would say all of the sketch shows after that kind of take off in a certain manner on the Pythons. I don't think you'd have Saturday Night Live if not for Flying Circus. I don't think that some of the best sketch comedians would have the same effect had it not been for Python. You wouldn't have gotten the Chappelle Show or Key and Peele or any of these other ones that are in the pipeline of sketch comedy in the same way. And putting these movies together, I think, has an effect. Now, these are different as far as stitching together a bunch of sketches, essentially, into a cohesive shell. But in addition to that, and how important this movie is to a lot of comedians and a lot of big comedians, like I've said before, the legacy of this has grown exponentially since its initial debut in 1975. It has a cult following. The fact that the Black Knight is still understood or is a cultural touchstone, at least in some circles, I think adds to it. The fact that we were able to bring out an entire Tony Award-winning Broadway play that is now being made, or the musical version of that is being made into a movie, as I mentioned to you off air, but that originally was being done at 20th Century Fox and now is being done at Paramount. And I don't know when that's going to start filming because the filming schedules are all over the place. But I think this just continues to have a long-term, or like a new generation is exposed to it repeatedly, and it just comes to a new audience, seems to have an effect, seems to have a small but loyal cult following, and fans just pop up all over the place. This still has significance, and I think a lot of people have seen this movie, and despite my lack of personal enjoyment, I recognize that this does have an effect on the public at large, so 9.5.
You've won me over. I'll agree with your number. One story I just wanted to tell when you're talking about that is that I watched an interview, and I want to say it was on David Letterman years ago with Eric Idle, and he was telling the story about how he's at home one night, and all of a sudden there's a knock at the door, and it's Keith Moon, the now deceased, but was drummer for The Who. And he said, "Oh, a bunch of us were all sitting around having some drinks, and we thought your show was hilarious, so we decided we would go and get you and bring you to the party." And so all of a sudden he's at a party, and it's with The Who and the Rolling Stones and a bunch of other British rock stars at the time, and they're all fawning over the Pythons. And so they're like, holy cow, we have rock stars treating us like rock stars.
Well, I know. I mean, the fact that a bunch of their movies were financed by, like, I think George Harrison was a big backer. Queen had a lot of money or invested in some of these movies. So it's not an unusual thing for them to have had an effect. All right, so impact significance. This one I went a lot lower, just because, and I think we've kind of teased this out at the time, it had a lot of mixed reviews. Most of the critics at the time basically lampooned this. They said it was slow, it was methodical, that the Pythons just couldn't let one joke be fine by itself, that they just had to continue past the point of excruciation. Or excruciation? Is that? Well, if it's not a word, it is now. Anyway, but I think Gene Siskel's review is rather scathing. That, like, it had a few moments of, it was 10 moments of actual laughter with 70 minutes of silence.
Kind of like watching Gene Siskel.
Well, especially now.
Well, back then. Unfortunately, the 10 minutes of laughter was usually when he was trying to be serious.
Fair enough.
It really didn't get a following, but, and The Life of Brian was so difficult to get anybody to back. Like, George Harrison basically was the producer and provided the money for it. But by 1981 or 2, when they did The Meaning of Life, by then they had a huge following. So I'm not going to go quite to the same level you did, because yes, it had a slow following to begin with, but as the Pythons and the Flying Circus got broadcast in the United States in the late 70s into the early 80s, it picked up a following. And the reason they did The Meaning of Life was because they were all trying to figure out how they were going to make money, because the show was over. And so some producers said, hey, we've got this big pile of cash. Write a screenplay. It'll sell. And so they wrote a bunch of scenes, and none of it made any sense. And they had a long session where they're all drunk, and basically some of them were taking swings at each other type of deal.
Okay, but this is now a movie
whatever.
much after this.
But no, we're talking about in the early 80s.
Yes, but this was from 1975. We're talking about this film.
I understand, but in 75 it had very little impact, but it started to gain steam within a few years afterwards. By about 77, 78, it became much bigger of a deal. So to that extent, I went with a 6.5.
I don't think this was setting the bar for comedy at the time, unless it was, again, I think this is more of a cult movie, although I would say some of the best comedies are cult movies. So I gave it a 4.5 because I think it was just a tick under average reception in its immediate 5-year run, particularly given the story you mentioned about Life of Brian. That came, 79, I think? And that one they had a lot of trouble trying to get funding and backing for. So, George Harrison and some of the other ones ended up making out like bandits because that one did extraordinarily well. But you would think if this movie had done a little bit better in its immediate significance or presence, I think it would have had a much different impact. And this one just was not something that in the moment was as impactful.
No, that's not why The Life of Brian, they had difficulty in getting it made. It was the subject matter. Back in that time frame, when you're poking fun about...
But if this movie had been ultimately successful, they would have gained a level of trust that I think they would have been a bit beyond the reproach.
I think you don't understand what society was like at that time in the 70s. So
most likely not, since it was at least 11 years before I was ever born, let alone in a level of adult consciousness.
Correct. No, there was. Lenny Bruce in the 60s was persecuted for jokes about the church. The 60s and 70s, it pushed the envelope, but it was not mainstream. And you would have had a hard time with that subject matter, no matter how well the Holy Grail would have done getting The Life of Brian done for that reason.
All right, so what did you have down for novelty then?
Well, it was unique because it was a historical piece written entirely nonsensical with a comedy base. I don't remember ever seeing a film like it before. It predated very, Airplane and some of the other films of that genre where it's basically just joke after joke after joke. And so I gave it a fairly high novelty score for that reason because I don't ever remember seeing anything like it before. So I went with a 9 on this for that very reason.
All right, so this is where I'm going to quibble with that number just slightly. Not for a matter of opinion, but rather a matter of fact. I would say this is a genre film and that they're writing jokes around a genre film because you're poking fun at medieval or some type of fantasy with King Arthur and that sort of thing. And King Arthur had been done, at least movie quality wise, before that. Now, they were doing it on a shorter budget, so thus why they went to some more absurd extremes with the coconuts and then the final sequence, which we'll get here to in a minute. But how is this any different? The comedy's different. That's where I separate it. But as far as a genre-breaking comedy, how is this that much different than Young Frankenstein or Blazing Saddles that came before it? Now, in the 70s, this is experimental. This wasn't something tried and true. It's not like Scary Movie or some of the other things, but I do knock it a little bit for that.
Well, the difference is that, yes, there are funny lines and funny moments in Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein and such, but they're there's a central story that you're telling with jokes written into it. This is more of its jokes, and they just filled it in with a central story to hold it together.
So the approach, and again, the humor style is different. So I'm not going to quibble with that. I went with a 7 because of that. But I think as far as how to do a comedy movie, I can't give it full merits on that edge of it.
Okay, I understand your point.
So what was your number again?
9.
All right, so that's an 8. I think that's reasonable. Classicness, this is going to be probably more suggestive than or subjective than we otherwise have been. And this is going to be the difficulty with comedies, is whether the jokes hold up. I'm sure for you they do. For me, they do not. I went with a bellwether 5. Very rarely did I get anything more than a chuckle from this movie. And I've told you repeatedly, the ending, it's even worse now that I've re-seen it. I just thought that like they had some explanation behind the arrest or whatever else. But I do have one important figure on my side about the ending. Notably, John Cleese. John Cleese has said the most regrettable thing about this movie is the ending. He hates it.
Okay.
And apparently the only reason that they went for this is again, they were out of money, and there was supposed to be some big battle sequence that Michael Palin wrote about at some point, but they ran out of money, so they thought it was more absurd, and Michael Palin thought it was funnier for them to just get arrested.
Okay.
But I gave it a bellwether 5.
And really, if you stop and think about it, how did Seinfeld end?
I don't care because I didn't think Seinfeld was funny either. Unpopular opinion.
Uh-huh. When I saw how Seinfeld ended, I thought of the ending of the Holy Grail, which is they tried to find the most absurd thing you could, which is they ended up all arrested and in jail. And so I thought that was really an homage to to Monty Python. I would love to ask Seinfeld that, or Larry David, if that's entered into their consideration at all. But having watched a few episodes of Arrested Development, Larry David's sense of humor is not far off from being a Python.
Larry David has nothing to do with Arrested Development.
Excuse me.
Do you mean Curb Your Enthusiasm?
Excuse me, yes. Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Okay. Very different shows.
Yes.
So what was your classicness score?
I went with a 8.5 because there is some datedness of the jokes. You know, if you look back on it, and the only way I think sometimes it ages better than it does, they did a lot of cross-dressing and a lot of homosexual jokes. But a large portion of that, and you can say it ages better because Graham Chapman was gay. And so...
Oh, I guess I didn't know that.
Yes. And he was right in the middle of writing most of those jokes and being involved in most of those jokes. So, to some extent, because of that, you can give them a little more wiggle room than what you should.
I certainly don't think that they had... Well, and maybe this is just... I'm either having a huge blind spot or something else. I really didn't see a whole lot of cringy jokes for modern sensibilities in this. There were a couple of things sexually, but like nothing that got my antenna up on the modern liberalism or political correctness, you know, the PC police type of sentimentality that I often have. But you know, there's no real racist jokes in here because everybody's white anyway. There, like you said, I really didn't even get that there were really any homosexual jokes or anything that, you know, again, I just, there's nothing in here from that point of view that you might get we're still debating when it's going to be appropriate again to do Blazing Saddles.
Yes, that was a conversation I was having with your mother's sister and grandmother over lunch, because we were talking about the film the recording for tonight, and we were talking about that. And of course, Sarah, your sister, says, "Well, what's wrong with Blazing Saddles?"
Oh, Sarah.
I'm like,
Sarah. Poor innocent Sarah.
Yes, and of course, your mother says, "Well, the entire thing is extremely racist." And I said, "Yeah, but you know who wrote all the jokes? Racist jokes was
it's
Richard
racist
Pryor.
in the same. It's racist in the same way that doing a musical called Springtime for Hitler is racist. I mean, it's
written by a Jew.
Taking back a certain level of power because the primary hero or character is a black sheriff in a Western. When most Westerns, if they featured a black person, they barely got any speaking lines and were usually a farmhand.
Yes.
So there is a bit of some reclamation, and I know saying that as a white person is kind of maybe another big blind spot for me, but I think that was the heart of what the movie was supposed to be. But interspersed in there are a ton of bad name-calling jokes, racial jokes, stereotypical jokes. Yeah, it's just chock full of that. So anyway.
Even to the Busby Berkeley scene at the end with Dom DeLuise. Boy, that's a cringeworthy moment in and of itself.
But we don't want the Irish.
Yes.
All right. Anyway, rewatchability. Do you want mine first or do you want your own?
Oh, give yours.
All right. So this isn't on the level of some of the silent films that I watched because I have a hard time with silent films, so I can't put it as a 1 in all good consciousness. It's not Out of Africa, which is just overly long and for no good reason, even though I did get some level of enjoyment from that, so it wasn't even quite at that level. And maybe I'm being a bit harsh, but we wanted to create new barometers, so I give it a 2. Words cannot express how dumb I think this movie is and how difficult it is for me to hold my attention on this because there's no central narrative to the story. I've told you repeatedly that narrative is one of the biggest things to me. And if you want to ruin a movie for me, have the narrative not make any sense. And in this movie, there's no flipping narrative. It just goes constantly back and forth between things they apparently thought were funny.
And you find that Christopher Nolan is the greatest director today? I mean, his narratives are all over the place.
No. First off, if you want to get into a conversation with Christopher Nolan, to follow his narratives is somewhat of a puzzle. So I find that engaging. He's my favorite director. I did not say he was the best director because partly he really disappointed me on Tenet. But that's another day and another movie.
Yes. A few years from now, at the best.
Rewatchability.
Well, I'm going to balance you out. I don't give this score often. 10.
All right.
I mean, I watching it again, there's certain scenes and certain lines that I forgot about because I don't get to watch it as much as I thought would like to. Because I know it annoys most of the people around me about it, watching it too much or too frequently. But
well, there's just a certain level of absurdity and dryness that just doesn't connect in the same way from My Funny Bone.
I appreciate lots of variations in comedy, all kinds of different things. I mean, I was having a very stressful day, and I needed about 15 minutes to just completely change my attitude. I happened to turn on my TV in my office, and they had Naked Gun 33 1/3 on, which is a lot of physical humor at the Academy Awards, and I just bust out laughing. I could not stop laughing. I laughed for 15 minutes and felt so much better. But again, physical humor, I enjoy. I like, there's a ton of different things I can appreciate. And so I just have an appreciation for the dryness of this and for the just absurdity of the situation.
Honestly, I'm going to knock myself a little bit here. I'm a comedy snob. I have a very small cross section of things that appeal to me as funny, and so I recognize that I'm never going to get every piece of comedy that's out there. It's a very small cross section between like intellectual and sarcastic humor, and occasionally a surprising or physical bit will get me, but that only works once or twice. I can very rarely do it multiple times and it make a whole lot of sense to me.
Which is why you do not appreciate Peter Sellers in the Pink Panther movies.
No. Okay, I should put a caveat. I like the original Pink Panther because I love David Niven. But past that,
Okay.
So, all right, to recap for everybody, in case, since I didn't do the averages at home, we agreed on a 9.5 for Legacy, which oddly enough I talked you up on. Impact Significance, we had a 5.5 average. Novelty, 8. Classicness, 6.75 average. Rewatchability was a 6. 9.5 for audience score, so out of a 95%. The critic score actually is 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. And that gives us a total of 45.25 points. So pretty well right in the smack dab of the middle of the list.
Okay.
So, any remaining questions?
I don't. I've seen this film enough. I've heard enough. I've read enough. I've talked about it. Seen enough interviews being done by the Pythons. I've watched all the specials they've done. So no, I don't have any remaining questions.
I only have one. What is the capital of Assyria?
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us and the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week we will be doing Wall-E with special guest Roger Walkoff, which, as I mentioned earlier, is available on Disney+, so please go watch that before you listen to next week's episode. You won't want to miss that one. Please like, subscribe, review, or whatever on whatever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at @gmotepodcast, or The Greatest Movie of All Time is available through the show links that are in the episode notes. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Anchor FM.